We're only in May and 2023 has already shaped up to be a very good year for gaming, in theory. With the likes of Hogwarts Legacy, The Last of Us now finally out on PC and Star Wars Jedi Survivor being released at the end of April, all with the fatal flaw of terrible launches. Which brings us on to what we're looking at today, the newest game from Arcane Studios, Redfall, which has also launched with its fair share of problems. But it wouldn't be an eTeknix video without some benchmarks, so we'll be taking a look at how well it performs on the best of the best from both Nvidia and AMD. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer, I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Redfall from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son, it is me, Andy Redfall from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So Redfall has been the subject to a lot of criticism recently, with bad performance and bugs being the biggest issues that players have noticed. And we did notice our fair share of problems while running our own internal testing. But before we can get into that, we need to look at the performance of the game. Now, to test that, we are doing a lot of testing behind the scenes on a whole host of cards, but for this video we wanted to focus on two cards in particular, the RTX 4090 and the RX 7900 XTX. Both run at the low, medium, high and epic presets, all at 1080p, 1440p and 4K. We also tested the game with upscaling technology on the epic preset at each resolution to see how they both handle that too. Now for our system, we used our GPU test bench consisting of an Intel Core i9 12900K on an Asus Maximus Z690 Hero motherboard with 32GB of Patriot Viper Venom 6000MHz memory, and for our SSD, we used the Seagate Firecooler 530 1TB NVMe drive to alleviate any bottleneck. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting with the low quality preset, and we can see right off the bat that the 7900 XTX outperforms the RTX 4090 in both 1080p and 1440p, performing a respective 15 and 16% better than the 4090. At 4K however, Nvidia gets to stretch its legs a bit and performs a decent 9% better than AMD. But with both cards performing over 100 frames a second, this 12 frame difference seems somewhat unnoticeable and could be the sign that the 4090 is bottlenecked at lower resolutions. Moving up the graphics settings to the medium preset, we see the same trend as we did on low. 1080p was stronger on the 7900 XTX, with 5% more performance compared to the RTX 4090. And while 1440p was also better performing on the AMD card, it wasn't by much. Nvidia is again the better performing card at 4K with 15% more frames than AMD, which is quite a stark difference compared to the performance we saw at the two lower resolutions. The only key point to look at is that Nvidia clearly has stronger 1% lows, even if the average is slightly lower. The next quality preset is high, and would it surprise you to learn that the 7900 XTX was the better performing card at 1080p and 1440p? Because yes, again, it did perform better than the 4090 with 4% more performance at 1080p and a small 1% more frames at 1440p, which could be chalked up as margin of error. Then, in typical fashion at 4K, the 4090 is once again the better option with 21% more FPS than the 7900 XTX. Again, Nvidia still manages to come in with better dips in performance compared to AMD and at all three resolutions. The final quality setting is the epic preset, and now I'm starting to sound like a broken record, as the 7900 XTX performed better than the 4090 at both 1080 and 1440p once again, with 13% more performance at 1080p and 8% more at 1440p. And again, 4K was no surprise as the 4090 was again the better performing card of the two, with a pretty staggering 27% more performance over the AMD card. What was interesting though was that this time AMD came in with slightly better 1% lows at the lower resolutions, but fell pretty hard at 4K, a resolution that you'd assume would be able to run at 4K pretty well, though at 94 FPS it's not bad at all. So a pretty clear win for AMD at the lower resolutions, but Nvidia managed to claw it back at 4K, which arguably is what you'd be looking to play at if you had a flagship card from either Team Red or Team Green. But we didn't stop our testing here, as we also wanted to look at how the game performs when we add upscaling into the mix. And with Redfall featuring both DLSS and FSR, we are able to directly compare the cards to see what kind of performance increase we actually see. Obviously, Nvidia do have one trick up their sleeve, as DLSS 3 is exclusive to Nvidia, as AMD haven't actually released FSR with frame generation yet. Now, when we finally get some games launch or add FSR 3, we will definitely be looking at doing a feature on it, comparing the performance gains and visual quality to DLSS 3. So make sure you're subscribed to see that from us in the future. So upscaling, and starting off at 1080p, we see that DLSS actually lost us 1 FPS on the 4090, which is likely margin of error. But what could also be margin of error is the 1 FPS increase in FPS we saw from using FSR on the 7900 XTX. Both of these changes are less than 1% and are realistically not noticeable. So here you are actually better off leaving upscaling turned off and not losing some visual quality. Also at 1080p, you're unlikely to need upscaling on these cards anyway, and could actually be a bug in the game, as you'd expect some difference, even if quite small. DLSS 3 does make a huge difference, however, with the average sitting a gigantic 97% higher in FPS than the performance we saw from standard DLSS. So with higher refresh rate monitors, this is a bit of a no-brainer and definitely gives Nvidia the edge by a huge margin. Moving on to 1440p, and we see a similar story as we did at 1080. DLSS does nothing but take a few frames away from our average, giving us 1.5% less FPS on average, whilst FSR also sees a small single FPS boost in performance, equating to less than 1% more performance. DLSS 3 was also the same story, as the performance increase is staggering, with an almost unbelievable 104% increase in FPS over regular DLSS, which now puts it 84% ahead of AMD. Then to finish up, upscaling at 4K, and here we find that DLSS and FSR made an actual difference, presumably because there was little to no bottleneck like we would have had at 1080 and 1440p. DLSS saw a 6% increase in performance for the 4090, with FSR earning the 7900 XTX a much stronger 44% increase in performance over standard rasterization. This means that for the first time, the 7900 XTX is the better choice at 4K, with 6% more performance than the RTX 4090 when conventional upscaling is enabled. Then DLSS 3 comes along and blows AMD out of the water, where the 4090 suddenly gains a large 57% more frames per second over standard DLSS, which in turn gives it 48% more performance than the already impressive FSR numbers that we saw on our AMD card. So lots of numbers, but some pretty key takeaways, and that really comes down to these two high-end cards and kind of where they're positioned. You could argue that 4K is where you'd want to be playing, and with that Nvidia has the upper hand, while AMD takes the crown at the lower resolutions where you can garner higher performance, but this isn't a competitive game where you need tons and tons of performance. So yeah, a bit of a tricky one. But performance out the way, we need to analyse the visuals of the game. And I had previously mentioned the issues that players have been finding since the game's very rocky launch. We found our own issues that we will come on to, but first we should look at graphics and how settings affect them. Standing next to textures such as walls, the quality was acceptable even on the low preset, with barely any noticeable changes to the visuals, even when we start to step away from them a bit. But from further away, things start to get much worse on the lower quality settings. Even CSGO, a game from 2012, looks better at the lowest settings than Redfall does at points. The issue here appears to be draw distance. The lowest preset brings the draw distance right down, and as a result, it doesn't take much distance to lose a lot of quality. These issues are fixed somewhat when we up the settings to higher presets, but something that continues to be an issue at all settings is shadows. They, quite frankly, look bad. We noticed in just a small area a lot of different issues with shadows, ranging from flickering to pulsing and even downright disappearing and reappearing right in front of our eyes as we turn our head just a little from side to side. During our testing, we also noticed that the enemy AI is, well, incredibly simple. When you're spotted by the cultist enemies, all they do is shoot and stand still, then move and shoot some more. There were a few moments where the AI got stuck in trees and couldn't figure out how to get out, and the vampire fights are, well, no better. They consist of backing up and shooting the vampire whilst it runs towards you before doing a single swipe. But the real enemy here is actually the environment, because it's so cluttered that you kind of constantly walk into things and then get stuck. And that's when you take damage. Either that or the vampire teleports behind you and gets a kind of cheap hit in before you get a chance to turn around and keep shooting. Now, once the vampire has run out of health, you then need to walk up to it and press F to basically win. But if you don't do that fast enough, then you have to fight it from the beginning all over again. Oh, and don't forget to be holding a staked weapon when you press F, or it just simply won't work, because I guess it doesn't make sense to have a stake as your melee weapon. A multitude of other small issues really didn't help make the experience fun, like aiming guns for example. Your aim is so shaky that it's almost impossible to be precise with your shots, and the iron sights on guns are slightly off too, as when I finally think I've got a good shot, I end up missing. Now in terms of performance, it ran okay. The game had a clear preference for AMD at 1080p and 1440p, with the Nvidia being the obvious choice for 4K. And when using upscaling, we found that it really wasn't worth it unless you're using DLSS 3, which isn't really the solution for everyone, since the cost to get a card that supports it is so high at the moment. But as we test lower end cards, we may see some noticeable changes on them compared to the 40 series. And also, it's not a great solution, because even though this game does run well enough on these cards, they are top of the line. And on a lower end card like most gamers have, there will be problems with performance. And that's not through any fault of AMD or Nvidia, it's just the game. It seems more and more that developers are not putting the effort into releasing a quality product, and unfortunately this kind of results in expensive games that people buy and then can't play. Now this is nothing new, as it famously happened to No Man's Sky and then more recently Cyberpunk 2077. But those games both had a sort of redemption, because behind their faults, they were fun games, and all it took was a little TLC to make it playable. So do I think that Redfall will have a redemption arc like those games? Well, no, not really, because unlike with Cyberpunk and No Man's Sky, Redfall isn't very fun at its core, and it will take more than some bug fixes to make it a good game. It needs to be reworked, and if anyone at Arcane is actually listening, please start with movement. This game plays like it wants to be fast, but it isn't. And maybe I would have had more fun if it felt more like I was some kind of doomslayer for vampires and not just some guy with, I don't know, boring powers. So maybe there's hope, but yeah, what do you think? Was this a game that you were looking forward to? Have I completely put you off of it? And what do you think of the performance overall? I mean, it is good on both AMD and Nvidia, but the game itself needs a lot of work. For now, that about wraps it up, as we have to get back to testing lower end cards on this frankly terrible game. So let me know what card you want to see the performance on, and yeah, we'll try and include it. That aside, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing, and if you love what we do and appreciate the huge effort that we put into these videos and want to get access to a ton of cool features, including monthly live Q&A sessions, exclusive behind the scenes content, and much more, then the link for all that is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye bye.